Imagine it's 17 June 1930. You are a 43-year-old wheat farmer living in Wichita, Kansas. You wake before sunrise in a small white clapboard house with a creaking porch, a wood stove in the kitchen, and two coffee tins hidden above the pantry shelf with your family's savings inside. Your boots are still dusty from yesterday's fieldwork, your oldest son is feeding the chickens, and your wife has already started counting the bills that must be paid before harvest. You do not think of yourself as rich or poor. You think in bushels, rain, rail freight, and whether the bank in town will keep rolling your loan for one more season. You have been told that Washington is finally going to protect men like you, that foreign competition is the reason prices feel weak, and that one strong law can build a fence around American prosperity. Then, sometime that day, President Herbert Hoover signs the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. If you have ever wondered why governments keep reaching for tariffs, even after history has shown how dangerous they can become, stay with me. What you are about to hear is not a theory. It is a pattern. It has happened before. In different countries, under different leaders, with different slogans. And if you find value in this kind of historical clarity, subscribing takes 2 seconds. It keeps you ahead of what most people never see coming. At first, nothing looks dramatic. The sky over Kansas does not change color. The wheat does not stop growing. The train still rattles through town. That is how trade wars usually begin. Not with a bang, but with a stamp on paper. Not with empty shelves on day one, but with tiny changes in price, supply, and confidence that spread like cold water through floorboards. A tariff is just a tax on imports. Simple enough. But when one country raises that wall, other countries often answer with walls of their own. Soon the flow of goods starts to choke. Then credit tightens. Then orders fall. Then jobs disappear in places no politician mentioned in the speech. For the farmer in Wichita, the promise was protection. The reality was something else. Within 2 years, about 24 countries had adopted retaliatory duties of their own. U.S. imports from and exports to Europe fell by roughly 2/3 between 1929 and 1932. Global trade also collapsed by similar proportions in those years. Later research found that countries that retaliated cut their imports from the United States by an average of 28 to 32%. The law had been sold like an umbrella, but it opened like a trap door. And that is what this video is really about. Not one tariff, not one president, not even one country. It is about the trade war quietly reshaping every economy on the planet, and the old historical pattern hiding inside the new headlines. Because trade wars do not just change what crosses a border. They change who gets paid, who gets squeezed, where factories move, what families can afford, and which nations become the next workshop of the world. Before we go further, there is something important to understand. A trade war is not really about goods, it is about pressure. It is one country trying to force another country to change by making trade more painful. On paper, that sounds straightforward. In real life, it works more like putting a kink in a garden hose. You may slow the water to one flower bed, but the pressure builds everywhere else. Prices rise at home. Suppliers look for detours. Foreign governments retaliate. Companies redraw maps. The river does not stop. It changes course. That is the secret key that unlocks the whole story. Modern economies are not separate machines sitting side by side. They are one giant clock with parts made in many places at once. A car assembled in one country may use steel from another, chips from a third, chemicals from a fourth, and financing priced in a fifth. So when tariffs strike, the blow lands far beyond the intended target. The visible part is the import tax. The invisible part is the chain reaction. A manufacturer pays more for inputs. A retailer raises prices. A farmer loses an export market. A shipping company reroutes. A government launches subsidies to calm angry voters. The bill moves from hand to hand like a hot coal nobody wants to hold. This is why trade wars so often feel confusing. Politicians describe them like duels. History shows they behave more like weather systems. They drift, they spread. They hit people who were not in the room when the decision was made. And because the damage moves through supply chains slowly, leaders can always claim the pain came from something else. A weak economy, a foreign shock, greedy companies, bad luck. But when you know what to watch for, the pattern becomes as clear as footprints in snow. The first part of that pattern is that protection often arrives after a deeper weakness has already started. Smoot-Hawley is the classic example. By the late 1920s, American farmers were already hurting. European agriculture had recovered after the First World War. U.S. farmers faced overproduction, weak prices, and heavy debt. Tariffs were presented as a shield. In truth, they were more like boards nailed over a cracked window while the foundation was sinking. Congress raised already high U.S. tariff rates further in June 1930, and more than 1,000 economists urged Hoover to veto the bill. He signed it anyway. Look at what happened next. Other governments did not politely accept the new rules. They answered. Canada, Europe, and others moved against American goods. Later studies using quarterly trade data across 99 countries found that retaliation was real and targeted. Countries did not simply buy less in general, they cut back on key American exports, especially products that mattered to the United States. That is the cruel logic of a trade war. Once it begins, each side looks for the other side's throat. Now put yourself back in Kansas. You are not reading trade tables. You are watching grain prices, local credit, and neighbors leaving town. The pain does not arrive with a label saying tariff. It shows up as fewer buyers, tighter loans, delayed orders, and more fear. This is how ordinary people experience a trade war, not as ideology, as uncertainty, as the feeling that the road you trusted yesterday is no longer there today. The market that seemed solid turns out to be ice over dark water. And this is where the first myth dies. Trade wars are not fought only at ports and customs desks. They are fought in farm counties, warehouse towns, railroad hubs, and family kitchens. They fall hardest on people whose margins are already thin. The wheat farmer, the shopkeeper, the borrower with no cushion. Smoot-Hawley did not cause the Great Depression by itself. The collapse in output was already severe. But history is clear that the tariff war deepened the strain, reduced trade further, and made an already broken world economy even more brittle. Protection did not restore confidence. It advertised panic. Here's something I want you to think about before we go further. When a government says it is protecting jobs, which jobs do you picture first? The jobs inside the protected factory or the others? Or the jobs scattered across the rest of the economy that depend on lower costs and open markets? Drop your answer in the comments. Seriously, because what I am about to show you next is the part of this story that most people never hear, and it changes everything. This brings us directly to the second act, and it takes place half a century later in a very different world. It is May 1981. America is not in a depression. Japan is booming. Japanese automakers are selling smaller, fuel-efficient cars into the United States after the oil shocks of the 1970s. Detroit is in trouble. Plants are closing. Workers are angry. Congress is demanding action. President Ronald Reagan talks the language of free markets. But under the surface, politics is pulling in the other direction like an undertow. The result was not a classic tariff at first. It was something called a voluntary export restraint. That sounds polite. It means one country agrees to limit how much it sells, so another country can avoid openly imposing a quota. On 1st May 1981, Japan announced that it would cap auto exports to the United States at 1.68 million vehicles for the coming year, then keep the limit with only partial allowance for market growth. The stated goal was to give American car makers breathing room, but breathing room is not the same as recovery. Sometimes it is just a more comfortable room in which to avoid change. Now here is where it gets interesting. When imports are limited, the story does not end with fewer foreign cars. Prices shift, product mix changes, incentives change. Japanese firms, facing limits on how many cars they could send, began moving upmarket. If you can only sell a certain number of cars, you make each one more profitable. So the restraint helped push producers toward higher value models. It also encouraged Japanese companies to build inside the United States. Honda opened in Ohio, Nissan moved into Tennessee, Toyota and others expanded American production over time. The wall did not stop foreign competition. It changed its shape. That is one of the most counterintuitive facts in trade history. Tariffs and quotas often do not bring the old world back. They force companies to build a new one somewhere else. The factory does not vanish. It migrates. Like water finding a crack in rock, capital looks for the path around the barrier. By the time the voluntary restraint era finally ended in 1994, the U.S. market had been permanently altered. Japanese brands were no longer simply exporters. They had become manufacturers on American soil, and ordinary people felt the shift in contradictory ways. Some American workers got time, some communities got investment, some consumers paid more, some firms that should have modernized faster instead used protection as a pillow. That is the second big rule of trade wars. The benefits are concentrated and visible. The costs are spread out and easier to miss. A saved plant makes headlines. 1 million households paying a little extra do not. There's an older echo here in 1962, when the European Economic Community raised barriers on imported chicken. Washington retaliated. By December 1963, President Lyndon Johnson imposed retaliatory duties on several products, including light trucks. That measure, born in the so-called Chicken War, outlived the dispute that created it. Decade after decade, it stayed. A temporary weapon became a permanent feature of the market. Think about that for a moment. A fight over poultry helped shape the American pickup truck market for generations. Foreign firms tried to route around it. Some shipped cab chassis without beds and finished them in the United States until customs closed that loophole in 1980. Others built locally. Consumers saw fewer imported truck options. Domestic producers enjoyed shelter. The original argument faded. The tariff remained like scaffolding left around a building so long that people forgot what it was holding up. This leads to the deeper lesson. Trade wars create sediment. Even after the speeches end, the policy layers remain. One tariff here, one quota there, one export control somewhere else. Over time, markets are not just protected, they are reshaped. The winners are the firms nimble enough to change geography, redesign products, or shift production before everyone else. The losers are often the ones trapped between rising costs and falling flexibility. This leads to the third part, still unfolding. In 2018, the United States launched the biggest modern tariff offensive in decades. $283 billion of imports were hit. China and other partners retaliated with tariffs on $121 billion of U.S. exports. The argument was national strength. At first, many imagined the burden would fall on China, but research found the cost passed into domestic prices in the United States. American consumers and importers paid in cash. Prices jumped 12% for washing machines, and even dryers rose in cost. Consumer costs increased by more than $1.5 billion a year, while only about 1,800 jobs were created. Now follow the shock out into rural America. China had been the top export market for U.S. soybeans. Then retaliatory tariffs hit. Suddenly, the trade war moved from papers into grain bins and loan books. The government launched huge aid packages to rescue farmers. The policy became both wound and bandage. Soybeans piled in storage because buyers had vanished and elevators slowed down. Trade wars moved through the economy like a crack in glass. Strike one corner and the fracture runs much farther than your hand. Direct reliance on China fell, but Canada, Mexico, and ASEAN countries increased their import shares from China to fill the gap. Most people will never know what you now know. Hit subscribe, because trade wars are magnets pulling production into new shapes. Every barrier creates a shadow market. Some companies relocate or redesign supply chains, while others die quietly. Trade wars rarely stay in the lane where they begin. They widen into contests over technology and national security. When large economies fight, smaller economies become part of the ropes. Some gain factories, some get caught between rival blocs. The people making the biggest speeches are rarely carrying the costs. Small farmers and factory workers carry the weight. When you protect an input like steel, you wound the industries that depend on it, like appliances and vehicles. One nation's blockage becomes another's opening. Vietnam and Mexico gained as the map got more layered for survivors. Large firms with cash can adapt, but small firms are stuck paying the new prices first. The storm does not hit every roof equally. Redundancy and resilience are wise, but not free. The world economy is rebuilding for rough ground with higher final prices. Survivors were flexible, understood that speed matters more than certainty, and protected their cash flow before the crisis hit. Back in Wichita in 1930, the farmer wanted simple protection, but history shows the long-term cost is usually a fog. Consult a professional before making financial decisions. If this helped you, share it and subscribe for more.